The land of Egypt, situated in the northeastern corner of the African continent, was home to one of the most enduring agricultural systems in the history of human civilization. The agriculture of ancient Egypt developed along the banks of the Nile River, which flowed northward through the desert landscape for approximately 667 miles before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. The river provided the essential water source that made farming possible in an otherwise arid region that received less than 1 inch of rainfall per year in most areas. The annual flooding of the Nile, known as the inundation, occurred with remarkable regularity each year between the months of June and September, depositing layers of nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain that bordered the river on both sides. This silt, called kemet in the ancient Egyptian language, gave the land its characteristic dark color and provided the minerals and organic matter necessary for successful crop cultivation without the need for artificial fertilizers. The agricultural year in ancient Egypt was divided into 3 distinct seasons, each lasting approximately 4 months, and these seasons were determined by the behavior of the Nile River rather than by temperature changes or precipitation patterns as in other regions of the world. The first season was called Akhet, which was the season of inundation, when the floodwaters covered the fields and farming activities were largely suspended. The second season was called Peret, which was the season of emergence when the waters receded and the land became available for planting and cultivation. The third season was called Shemu, which was the season of harvest when crops were gathered and stored for consumption throughout the coming year. This cycle repeated itself with monotonous regularity for thousands of years, generation after generation, as farmers along the Nile followed the same patterns that their ancestors had followed before them. The Nile River originated from 2 main tributaries, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, which joined together at the city of Khartoum in what is now the modern nation of Sudan. The White Nile flowed from the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, while the Blue Nile originated in the highlands of Ethiopia, where seasonal rains caused the river to swell each year. The floodwaters traveled northward through Egypt at a pace of approximately 30 to 40 miles per day, reaching the northern delta region several weeks after passing the southern city of Aswan. The height of the flood was measured using structures called nilometers, which were built at various points along the river and consisted of stone staircases or columns marked with measurement indicators. A good flood was considered to be approximately 15 to 16 cubits in height, which translated to roughly 26 to 28 feet above the normal river level. A flood that was too low meant that insufficient land would be covered with water and silt, resulting in poor harvests and potential food shortages. A flood that was too high could damage irrigation infrastructure, destroy homes built near the riverbank, and delay the planting season beyond the optimal time. The ancient Egyptians recorded the height of each year's flood on stone tablets and papyrus documents, creating a continuous record that spanned many centuries and provided valuable information for agricultural planning and tax assessment. The silt deposited by the flood contained approximately 3 to 5% organic matter along with various minerals including nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in quantities sufficient to maintain soil fertility year after year without depletion. This natural replenishment system allowed Egyptian farmers to cultivate the same fields continuously for generations without the need to leave land fallow or rotate crops for soil recovery purposes. The management of water in ancient Egyptian agriculture required the construction and maintenance of extensive irrigation infrastructure that distributed floodwaters across the cultivable land. The simplest irrigation method involved the construction of earthen banks called dikes or levees that ran parallel to the river and perpendicular to it, creating enclosed areas known as basins that could be filled with water during the flood season. These basins typically covered areas ranging from 1,000 to 3,000 acres in size, and each basin was surrounded by banks that stood approximately 6 to 10 feet in height to contain the floodwaters. Gates made of wood and reeds were installed at strategic points in the bank system to allow water to flow from one basin to another or to drain excess water back into the river after the soil had absorbed sufficient moisture. The water was held in the basins for approximately 40 to 60 days, allowing the silt to settle onto the fields before the remaining water was drained away to prepare the land for planting. In addition to basin irrigation, more complex methods were developed over time to lift water from the river to fields that were located at higher elevations beyond the reach of the floodwaters. The earliest method involved the use of a simple bucket carried by two people using a pole balanced across their shoulders, which allowed small quantities of water to be transported from the river to the fields through manual labor. This method was eventually replaced by the shaduf, a counterweighted lever system that consisted of a long pole balanced on a crossbeam with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other end. The shaduf allowed a single farmer to lift approximately 150 liters of water per hour from the river to the irrigation channels, reducing the physical effort required to water the crops during the dry season. Later periods saw the introduction of the sakia, a water wheel powered by animals such as oxen or donkeys that walked in circles to turn the wheel and lift water in buckets attached to the rim. The Archimedes screw was also used in later periods, consisting of a large screw inside a hollow pipe that was turned by hand to lift water from lower levels to higher levels through rotational motion. The primary crops grown in ancient Egypt were grains such as emmer, wheat, and barley, which formed the staple diet of the population and were used to make bread and beer. Emmer wheat was a hardy variety that grew well in the Egyptian climate and was resistant to pests and diseases that affected other types of grain. The wheat was harvested using sickles made of flint blades set into wooden handles, and the grains were threshed by having animals walk over the harvested stalks to separate the seeds from the chaff. The threshed grain was then winnowed by tossing it into the air so that the wind could blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grains fell back to the ground for collection. Barley was grown in similar quantities and was used primarily for the production of beer, which was consumed by people of all ages and social classes as a safe source of hydration and nutrition. The beer was brewed by baking loaves of bread made from barley dough and then crumbling them into water to ferment, resulting in a thick and nutritious beverage that contained low levels of alcohol. Flax was another important crop that was grown for the production of linen cloth, which was used for clothing, burial wrappings, and various household items. The flax plants were pulled from the ground by hand to keep the fibers intact, and the stems were soaked in water to soften them before being beaten and scraped to extract the long fibers suitable for spinning. The fibers were then spun into thread using drop spindles and woven into cloth on looms that were operated by skilled weavers who worked in workshops attached to temples or estates. Vegetables such as onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, beans, and chickpeas were grown in garden plots near the villages and provided additional nutrients to the diet, along with fruits such as dates, figs, grapes, and pomegranates. These crops were tended carefully by gardeners who used hand tools to loosen the soil and remove weeds that might compete with the cultivated plants for water and nutrients. The tools used in ancient Egyptian agriculture were simple in design but effective for the tasks required by the farming cycle. The plow was one of the most important tools and consisted of a wooden frame with a pointed share that was dragged through the soil to create furrows for planting seeds. The plow was pulled by oxen that were yoked together and guided by a farmer who walked behind the plow to steer it in straight lines across the field. In some cases, the plow was equipped with a seed funnel that allowed seeds to be dropped directly into the furrows as the plow moved forward, ensuring even distribution and reducing waste. Hoes made of wood with stone or copper blades were used for breaking up clods of earth and for weeding around young plants that were too delicate for the plow. Sickles with serrated edges were used for harvesting grain crops, and the blades were replaced regularly as they became dull from cutting through the tough stalks. Baskets made of woven reeds or palm fibers were used to carry harvested crops from the fields to the threshing floors and storage facilities. The storage facilities consisted of large silos made of mud brick that were shaped like beehives and sealed with plaster to protect the grain from moisture and pests. The silos were often built in groups near the temples or palaces where the grain was collected as tax payments and redistributed to workers and soldiers who served the state. Scribes recorded the quantities of grain stored in each silo using hieroglyphic numerals on pottery shards or papyrus scrolls, creating detailed accounts that were audited regularly to prevent theft or loss. The grain was measured using units such as the hacket, which was equivalent to approximately 4.8 liters, and the har, which was equivalent to approximately 76.8 liters. These measurements were standardized across the kingdom to ensure fairness in tax collection and wage payments to laborers who worked on government projects. The harvesting season was a time of intense activity that involved the entire community working together to bring in the crops before the weather changed or the grain became too dry and brittle. The grain was cut close to the ground to maximize the amount of straw collected along with the grain heads, and the straw was used for making bricks, baskets, and animal fodder. The harvested grain was transported to the threshing floor using donkeys or carts with solid wooden wheels that creaked slowly as they moved along the dirt paths between the fields and the storage areas. The threshing floor was a hard-packed surface located near the storage silos where the grain was spread out in thin layers for the animals to walk over. The animals were driven in circles over the grain for several hours until the kernels were separated from the stalks, and the process was monitored by farmers who turned the grain over periodically to ensure thorough threshing. After threshing, the grain was winnowed using wooden forks to toss the mixture into the air so that the wind could carry away the chaff while the grain fell back to the floor in a clean pile. The clean grain was then measured and poured into the storage silos where it was sealed until needed for baking, brewing, or distribution to the workers who built the tombs and temples. The cycle of planting and harvesting continued year after year, with little change in methods or tools, creating a rhythm of life that was predictable and steady for the people who lived along the Nile. The farmers woke before sunrise to work during the cooler hours of the morning and rested during the heat of the day when the sun was highest in the sky. Their meals consisted of bread and beer, along with occasional vegetables or fish from the river, providing sufficient energy for the physical labor required by the agricultural tasks. The clothing worn by the farmers was simple linen kilts that allowed for freedom of movement and protection from the sun without causing overheating during the workday. As the centuries passed, the methods of agriculture remained largely unchanged because the system was effective and required no innovation to maintain the productivity of the land. The soil remained fertile due to the annual deposition of silt, and the water supply was reliable due to the regular flooding of the river. The farmers learned to accept the conditions of their environment and adapted their practices to work within the constraints imposed by the natural world. There was no need for complex machinery or advanced technology because the simple tools and methods were sufficient to produce the food required by the population. The society was structured around the agricultural cycle, with festivals and religious ceremonies timed to coincide with the stages of planting and harvesting. The gods were thanked for the floodwaters and the harvest, and offerings were made to ensure the continuation of the cycle in the coming year. The priests managed the granaries and distributed the grain according to the needs of the community, ensuring that everyone had enough to eat during times of plenty and times of scarcity. The scribes kept records of the land ownership and the tax obligations, ensuring that the state received its share of the harvest to support the administration and the construction projects. The workers were paid in grain and beer, which they could use for their own consumption or trade for other goods and services within the local economy. The stability of the agricultural system contributed to the longevity of the civilization, allowing it to endure for thousands of years without significant disruption or collapse. The fields stretched out along the river like a green ribbon through the desert, providing sustenance for the people and the animals that lived in the region. The sound of the water flowing in the irrigation channels was a constant presence in the background of daily life, marking the passage of time and the rhythm of the seasons. The sight of the grain swaying in the wind was a familiar view that signaled the approach of the harvest and the completion of another cycle of growth. The smell of the damp earth after the flood receded was a sign of renewal and the promise of another year of production. The touch of the soil between the fingers of the farmers was a connection to the land that had supported their ancestors and would support their descendants. The taste of the bread and beer was a reminder of the labor that went into producing the food and the value of the sustenance provided by the earth. The silence of the night over the fields was broken only by the sounds of insects and the distant flow of the river, creating a peaceful atmosphere that encouraged rest and sleep. The stars moved slowly across the sky above the dark landscape, marking the hours until dawn when the work would begin again. The cycle continued without end, steady and unchanging like the flow of the river itself. The land remained fertile, the water remained abundant, and the people remained nourished by the gifts of the Nile. The history of the agriculture was a history of repetition and consistency, with each year mirroring the one before it in almost every detail. The methods were passed down from parent to child without modification, ensuring that the knowledge was preserved and the practices were maintained. The tools were repaired and replaced as needed, but the design remained the same throughout the generations. The crops were planted and harvested in the same way, at the same time using the same techniques. The storage facilities were built and filled according to the same standards, with the same measurements and the same records. The distribution of the food was managed according to the same rules, with the same allocations and the same oversight. The life of the farmer was a life of routine and predictability with little variation from day to day or year to year. The work was hard but familiar, and the rewards were sufficient to sustain the community through the seasons. The land provided everything that was needed, and the people took only what was required for their survival and the maintenance of their society. The balance between the land and the people was maintained through careful management and respect for the natural cycles that governed the agriculture. The flood came and went. The crops grew and were harvested, the grain was stored and consumed, and the cycle began again. The process was slow and steady without rush or excitement, creating a calm and monotonous rhythm that soothed the mind and encouraged rest. The details of the agriculture were numerous and specific, but they all contributed to the same outcome of sustained production and stability. The measurements were precise, the timing was accurate, and the methods were effective. The system worked without fail, year after year, century after century, providing a foundation for the civilization that rested upon it. The story of the agriculture is a story of continuity and endurance, with no dramatic changes or sudden events to disturb the peace of the narrative. The fields remained green, the river remained blue, and the sky remained clear over the land of Egypt. The farmers worked quietly in the fields, tending to the crops with care and attention to detail. The water flowed gently through the channels, nourishing the soil and the plants. The grain grew tall and strong, ready for the harvest when the time came. The silos were filled to capacity, storing the wealth of the land for the future. The people were fed and clothed, sustained by the bounty of the agriculture. The civilization flourished based on the reliability of the food supply and the efficiency of the production system. The history is recorded in the stones and the scrolls, preserving the knowledge for those who wish to learn about the past. The information is available for study and reflection, providing insight into the lives of the people who lived long ago. The details are fascinating in their simplicity and effectiveness, demonstrating the ingenuity of the human mind in adapting to the environment. The legacy of the agriculture remains visible in the landscape today. With the fields still cultivated along the banks of the Nile, the methods have changed somewhat with the introduction of modern technology, but the basic principles remain the same. The water is still needed, the soil is still prepared, and the crops are still planted and harvested. The cycle continues, linking the past with the present and the future. The story is told slowly and calmly, allowing the listener to relax and drift into sleep while thinking about the steady rhythm of the agricultural year. The words are chosen to be soothing and repetitive, creating a hypnotic effect that helps to quiet the mind. The sentences are long and flowing like the river itself, carrying the listener along without effort or strain. The information is presented without urgency or demand, inviting the listener to rest and let the words pass by unnoticed. The voice is steady and low, matching the tone of the content and the purpose of the recording. The goal is to provide comfort and relaxation, helping the listener to find peace and sleep in the midst of the busy world. The history of ancient Egyptian agriculture is a suitable topic for this purpose, as it is distant and removed from the concerns of modern life. The details are specific enough to occupy the mind, but boring enough to allow it to wander toward sleep. The repetition of the cycles and the methods creates a sense of safety and predictability that is conducive to rest. The listener can imagine the fields and the river and the farmers working quietly in the background, providing a soothing backdrop for the journey into sleep. The narrative winds down gradually, slowing the pace and reducing the complexity of the information as the end approaches. The final thoughts are peaceful and calming, inviting the listener to let go of wakefulness and embrace the rest that is needed. The sleep is deep and restful, brought on by the monotonous rhythm of the history and the voice that tells it. The land of Egypt rests under the star,